Okay, I guess we can start. So it's my honor to introduce Nikhil Bansal. He's currently at CWI and Eindhoven University of Technology. He will speak to us about discrepancy and its applications in approximation and rounding. I'm particularly excited that I was there at the inception of Nikhil's research on this. We were on a train from Dagstuhl to skiing in Switzerland, and he was reading, I think, Giselle's discrepancy textbook. And I asked him what it was. He explained the start of it. And I said, that's very nice, and went back to reading my graphic novel. So there should be some fable here about professors that read graphic novels and math books on trains and what happens to them. So, all right, Nikhil, looking forward to your talk.
Okay, thank you, Kirk, for the introduction. Yeah, you have a good memory. That was almost a decade ago. Yeah, and thank you to the organizers for really inviting me. It's a great pleasure and honor. I was really looking forward to being in Brazil, but yeah, unfortunately, but it's still great to see so many people here. So yeah, thank you for coming. So yeah, so I want to talk about discrepancy, which is a very classic area in combinatorics. It's almost around for 100 years. But lately it has found a lot of applications, especially in rounding and approximation algorithms. And part of this is because most of the results previously in discrepancy were like non-algorithmic and only existential. And now in the last 10 or so years, there has been a lot of progress in making these results actually polynomial time and algorithmic, and which have had a lot of applications. So my goal in this talk is to kind of give you a rough flavor of all these topics. So what is discrepancy? What are these algorithmic developments? And how they connect to approximation, and how maybe we can use them if we are algorithmic designers in like a black box way. Okay, so that's the rough plan, and let's begin. So hopefully people can see my mouse sort of when I move it on these things. So maybe I'll try to use that. Okay. So let's see. Yeah. So discrepancy, it's again a very classic thing in combinatorics. So the basic setting is the following. There is a universe of n elements, 1 through n. And let's say there are some subsets of this universe that we are interested in. And our goal is to color these elements red and blue, so that if we look at each of these sets, ideally we would like them to be as balanced as possible, right? So a bit more formally, so let's say we have some coloring chi of these n elements, and instead of red and blue, it's easier to think of like -1 and +1. So given such a coloring of these elements, I define the discrepancy of this coloring as the following. So you look at a particular set and you sum up the colors of the elements in that set, right? So if there are equal number of +1s and -1s, this will be 0. And in general, this absolute value of this sum will measure the imbalance between the pluses and the minuses. So the discrepancy of the coloring is like I take the maximum over all the sets that I care about. And that's how like bad this coloring is, right? That's the discrepancy of it. And given a set system that we care about, the discrepancy of that set system is the following. So you look at all the possible, maybe 2 to the n colorings of your universe, and look at the best discrepancy coloring, right? Like that's the discrepancy of this set system. Like what's the best possible way to color it? And yeah, and sort of we'll see various applications. It turns out to be a very sort of fundamental measure of the complexity of a set system. Okay, so another way to think about this problem slightly more generally, or the notion of discrepancy slightly more generally, is the following. So let's say you're given a matrix, and let's think of this as a m by n matrix. So I'll always denote m for the number of rows and n for the number of columns. Now we want to color the columns of this matrix by +1 and -1, or multiply them by +1 and -1, so that each row sum is as small as possible. Right. So if we think about it for a moment, if your set, like this matrix corresponds to the incidence matrix of a set system. So each row is a set and all the columns correspond to elements. It's really the same thing that we talked about. But in this way, we can write it compactly. So I can write like the discrepancy of a matrix A as, I look at all possible +1, -1 colorings X. So A times X just multiplies the columns by +1, -1. And I just look at the infinity norm of this column vector AX, right? So again, it's exactly the same thing. So yeah, so you can think of it as more generally, given a matrix A, you want to find a +1 -1 vector to multiply with so that this product has as small entries as possible. So as small infinite norm. Okay. Another sort of equivalent way, and this is called the vector balancing view, is that when you are given vectors in m dimensions, so think of these as the columns of this matrix, and then you want to give signs to these vectors. So xi to vector vi, and so that if you look at the signed sum, the entries of this signed sum or the coordinates or the infinity norm is as small as possible. Okay, so again, all these are the same things. So typically in discrepancy, people look at the infinity norm, and that's the way I've defined it. But one can also consider more general norms like given by general symmetric bodies and so on. But again, we won't talk much about these general norms. We'll just focus on the infinity norm. So, okay, good. So let's start with some very basics. So if you're given a set system or in general a matrix, one thing you can always do is, color these columns randomly, like just pick a random +-1 coloring where for each column you pick a sign independently with probability half, like either +1 or -1. And then you can see, and maybe this is a fact that we'll use again and again in this talk, so maybe let's go over this slowly. So I claim that the discrepancy of any row will kind of grow like square root n in the worst case, right? Let's say for a 0, 1 matrix. And more generally, like if you look at a row and suppose that corresponds to a set S, so since you're coloring it randomly, let's say red or blue, in expectation you would have exactly S over 2 elements red and S over 2 blue, but you will expect like a deviation since you're doing a random coloring about square root S, right? This is just the standard deviation. And more precisely, like if I look at a particular set S or row S, the probability that the discrepancy is bigger than C times square root S, the standard deviation, will vary like a Gaussian, like e to the minus C square roughly. Right. So again, this is just by central limit theorem or law of, strong law of large numbers or whatever, or Chernow bounds. But this is a fact we'll use again and again, like many times in this talk. So if there's one thing we should keep on top of our head, it's this fact that things vary as a Gaussian around the standard deviation. Okay, so so you can always do random coloring, and you'll get this kind of behavior. So in particular, if I have an arbitrary set system on m sets, so again, right, like if you look at a random coloring, we see that this will give you square root n square root log m discrepancy, right? Because square root n again is the worst case deviation for any row, because rows have size at most n, and square root log m comes because because I have m rows and I want to take a union bound over those. So I'll put C here to be like root log m, and if we do that, this number will be like 1 over polynomial in m. So I can take a union bound. So with high probability, like no sets discrepancy exceeds the square root and square root log m when we do a random coloring. Okay, so that's great. Maybe you might think, okay, you get at least something. So discrepancy theory in some sense is all about beating, that you can beat random. Like if you can't do better than random, that's not interesting at all. I mean, random is something very trivial. And notice random is really simplistic because you don't even look at the structure of your matrix A. So maybe if your matrix has some structure, you can do something much clever. So that's one thread in discrepancy to kind of understand this. And another very surprising thing is, like, even if your matrix has no structure, like suppose it was the worst possible thing, even then sometimes you can beat random, which perhaps is surprising at first glance because we are used to thinking of random like the probabilistic method giving you the best possible answer in many settings. But there is a very famous result of Joel Spencer almost 35 years ago, like from 1985, which says the following. So if you're given any arbitrary set system on n sets, so m is n just for simplicity, then notice that random will give you square root log n. Because of the union bound, you lose this extra root log n. But a famous conjecture by Erdős was that you don't need to lose this root log n. And actually, you can't beat root n. So this is right. So Erdős conjectured that actually, root n is the right answer. And Spencer proved this. And even though this improvement with this just root log n may not look so important, you're losing a square root n anyway. Why do we care about root log n? It turns out that techniques that Spencer developed, in particular what's called the partial coloring method, has really become the workhorse and a very, very powerful tool in discrepancy. And we'll actually go over this partial coloring method in quite some detail and I'll explain you what that is and how it works, right? So the point here is, again, yeah, if you have structure in your matrix, you can probably do much better. But even without structure, there are many surprising results. Like you can often beat what random will give you. Okay. So when you first look at discrepancy, it might seem like some contrived problem. It's about coloring elements red and blue or +1, -1. Like, why do we care about? Or it looks like a toy problem. But I want to kind of give you a couple of applications, mostly without proofs, but I'll try to give some intuition on why sort of this comes up in all over the place. So in fact, already in like computer science, there are a couple of books on this, one by Jirka Matušek on applications to computational geometry, and one by Bernard Chazelle on sort of, again, geometry, but many more applications to data structure lower bounds and complexity and so on. So let me give you some very rough idea. I mean, this will be far from exhaustive. So one idea is the following. So here is a general principle. So suppose your set system has low discrepancy. You can often use that to get sort of a good sparsification. So think of it like as a graph sparsification or your favorite sparsification problem. And roughly the intuition is the following. Like suppose you are given this set system and there was some way to color the elements with low discrepancy. So suppose for a moment discrepancy was 0, right? Like you could color the elements red and blue so that every set is equally red and equally blue. Then now if you just restrict your universe to the red elements, you have accomplished something very interesting, because you have a smaller universe. So each set has shrunk by sort of half its size, but you still sort of maintain the relative sizes of all these sets and so on. So all the combinatorial sort of relative frequencies are all preserved, right? So you can think of this as sort of a sparsification. And indeed, one can make this more precise. And often in geometry, like you care about epsilon nets and samples and so on, also in learning. So this kind of observation allows you to port a lot of results from discrepancy directly into these things. Another sort of historical thing that led to discrepancy was what's called quasi-Monte Carlo integration. So again, suppose you have some domain and you want to integrate some very complicated function on this domain. So you cannot like compute it symbolically or by hand. It's really some maybe a zillion variable function or something. So one standard way is just pick a point randomly in this domain and evaluate that function and like average over these various values, right? And it's well known that if you pick n points, like your error will roughly grow as, or like decrease as 1 over root n if you do that. But turns out you can actually do much better. So there is this whole area of quasi Monte Carlo integration where you can place these points much more carefully on this domain that you care about, and you can get like much better errors than 1 over root n. And this is actually used a lot in like computational finance and so on, and it's a very big community. And again, this kind of can be viewed as a sparsification because so I want to integrate this function on this. So imagine starting with a very, very continuous grid, like with very, very closely spaced, like infinitely many points, or the uniform measure on this set. And if you sort of start with this very dense placement of points and you gradually sparsify it, if your discrepancy was low, then you will end up with a sparse collection of points, which still is a very good representation of these original integral. So somehow, again, sort of I'm hand waving a bit, but hopefully this conveys an idea of how like this theme of sparsification connects to Monte Carlo integration. Okay. Let's look at some, again, completely different application, which is something I really like, and it's used a lot in computer science. So this is called the Steinitz problem, and the setting here is the following. So again, you're given vectors v1 through vn, and think of this as a large number of vectors, and maybe they're m-dimensional, doesn't matter, right? And let's say they're of unit length, just for concreteness. And let mu denote the average vector. So if I sum up all these vectors and divide by n, this is like the mean vector. Now, suppose what you want to do is you want to reorder these vectors or find a permutation so that if I look at any partial sum of the first k vectors in this ordering, right? So you want to kind of track this line. So again, like if I have no vector, the sum is 0. And if I sum up all the vectors, it's like n times mu. This is just the sum of all the vectors. Now, maybe you want to arrange them so that, as you go along your sequence, if you sum up the first k, you're tracking this linear line very closely. Okay, and sort of a basic problem. And this has a lot of history, this Steinitz problem. And again, if you do a random ordering of these vectors, you can show that, okay, you'll get a square root n for sort of the same reasons, square root n comes again. But actually, you can do much, much better. So yeah, so there is this result. Okay, these are the best results now for this Steinitz problem, that you can actually get square root log n, so exponential improvement on what random will give you. And this actually has a lot of applications in, let's say, dynamic programming, where, and roughly the idea is like, given some input, you can pre-process it by ordering it in a certain way, so that in dynamic programming, you typically build a table, and if you can argue that your state space from where you need to search your solution is small, so if you don't deviate too much from sort of the mean, you can usually reduce your search space a lot. And so this has been used in several problems to like really speed up dynamic programs and integer programming, like from doubly exponential to singly exponential and so on. So again, sort of a very surprising result that you can order things to track the mean very closely and not lose much. Okay, and again, you might think, what's the connection to this +1 -1? I mean, this is about permutations. So again, I won't give a proof, but there is sort of a cute connection. Like you can start with an arbitrary ordering, and once you have a low discrepancy coloring of these vectors, you can sort of use it to reorder to reduce this imbalance every time. And, okay. Let me give one final application, which again is sort of very surprising, and this is the one we'll be focusing on. And this is about rounding. So again, just to remind you, so a typical way to solve an NP-hard problem or get an approximation for it is, you first formulate a problem as a 0-1 integer program, which you can almost always do. So it looks something like this. You have some linear constraints and maybe some objective and these decision variables. And you look at a continuous relaxation where these variables can now take values in 0-1. And the nice thing is it becomes a linear program, so you can solve it optimally. Okay, so pictorially, maybe what's happening, maybe your integer optimum was here. It's a minimization problem. But now that you relax it, so you're minimizing over a wider domain. So maybe your fractional optimum solution is here. And one trick or like the main game in approximation algorithm is usually, okay, if I give you a good fractional solution, can you somehow take it and map it back to a integral solution? And if you can show, so this process is called rounding, of taking a fractional solution and going to an integral one. And if you can show that you don't lose much along this way, then this gives you a bound between optimum and your algorithmic solution, right? So if you can bound this fractional and algorithmic gap, this gives a bound here. And this is the whole game in approximation in some sense. And again, like many techniques have been developed in approximation to kind of do this. And often these are like very problem specific and so on. So here is a very surprising result, actually. Again, a very old result by Lovash, Wester, and Lovash, Spencer, and Wester-Gombe, which says the following. So suppose you're given any matrix A, so this can be completely arbitrary, and some fractional solution X. You can think of it in between 0-1 to the n, or like even real numbers to the n. So it's some n-dimensional thing. So the result says that you can round this fractional X to X tilde, which is an integer variable, so in Z to the n, so that the error between, so of course, if you round X to some X tilde, now you don't expect to satisfy your original constraints, right? So maybe like originally your solution X satisfied AX equal to B. Now, if I perturb X to X tilde like an integer, you won't satisfy this exactly. But what this is saying is that your error, when you round your X to X tilde, is at most what's called the hereditary discrepancy of A. So again, don't worry about what this hereditary means. It's just a slightly robust notion of discrepancy, but morally it's the same as discrepancy in like 99% of the applications. So it's saying that, yeah, for any matrix A, like your error never needs to be more than the discrepancy of A, right? And so this sounds very general, like, wow, this makes no assumption on A whatsoever. So maybe one can use this for approximations a lot. So actually, before telling you how, let me give you some proof idea of, again, why is there a connection to discrepancy at all, like with rounding and so on. So the intuition is the following. So suppose you had like a fractional solution AX equal to B, and think for a moment like X was all half vector and you want to round it to 0 and 1. So what we can do is, and suppose, right, like your matrix A has low discrepancy. So what that means is I can find a +1 -1 vector Y, so that A times Y has small entries, right? So yeah, so the row sums, if I multiply these columns by +1 -1, are small. So suppose that's the case, then the point is you can use this vector y to kind of guide you to round a variable up or down. Like if y is +1 for a coordinate, you can sort of round it up. If it's -1, you round it down to 0. So more formally, like if you look at x plus y over 2, because again, y is a +1 -1 vector and x was all half, then this x plus y over 2 will be a 0, 1 vector. And the point is now if I look at, okay, so my x tilde is like x plus y over 2. I've got my rounded solution. And this a of x tilde, a times x plus y over 2, is still roughly b because a times y is very small, right? Ax was b. So again, this was like for half integral solution, but you can easily generalize to general fractional solutions just by sort of looking bit by bit. But again, I'll spare the details. But hopefully this conveys the idea of, again, like how discrepancy comes in. So basically you're using this existence of some +1 -1 coloring for these things to decide how to round variables up or down. Right? So if you notice, this proof is very existential. Like it says, okay, if there is a good coloring +1 -1, you can round it, but it doesn't actually tell you how to find such colorings. So even though this like result was very old, it's almost 35 years old, it was kind of nice to know, but it wasn't really used because we didn't know how to find these low discrepancy colorings like in polynomial time. So we can't really use for algorithms. So it's sort of mostly existential. And again, yeah, what changed is that now we have algorithms for this. So I'll come to this part. So we can actually use these very strong ideas to get very good results. Okay, so yeah, so we saw if you have low discrepancy in your matrix, you can actually use it for good rounding. So before we go into this algorithmic part, let's see what was known or what are the techniques known for showing that a certain matrix with a certain structure has low discrepancy. These are sort of the more classic things. Right. So roughly the techniques can be divided into 3 generations. So one is what I call the linear algebraic method, and so this was actually developed almost 100 years ago, starting from the work of Steinitz in 1910 about the Steinitz problem that I talked about, and like refined by many other people in the 70s and 80s. And in the modern language, it's what's called iterated rounding, which we'll see later in this talk. So this is a very sort of 0 generation simplistic method. And then Spencer and Beck in early 80s developed what's called the partial coloring method, which again I'll describe in a bit of a detail, based on a very clever application of probabilistic method and the pigeonhole principle. So very surprising result at the time. And again, sort of this was discovered independently in the Soviet Union by Gluskin using completely different convex geometric ideas. So this was sort of the story in the 80s. And in late 90s, again, these convex geometric techniques were refined much more. Again, I won't have too much time to talk about this. And one could get stronger results. So the point was that these 2 techniques, though, so the partial coloring and Banachik, they kind of relied on pigeonhole principle and very sort of what we believe are usually non-constructive ideas, right? Like, so for example, the Spencer's result, it looks at the space of all possible 2 to the n colorings and then argues that there are some 2 colorings out there which have certain properties and so on due to pigeonhole principle. And so it wasn't clear at all how to make these things algorithmic or polynomial time, rather like, okay, one thing one could always do is like compute all these 2 to the n colorings and pick the best one. But besides that, it wasn't clear how to do that. And that's why these results were not so useful algorithmically. So just to also give a sense of these 3 generations of results. So let me focus on one example, which kind of will be a running example in this talk. Also gives you kind of a flavor of, if your matrix has some structure, what kind of results you can prove. So a very famous result is what's called for low degree set systems, or it's also known as the Beck-Fiala setting. And the setting here is the following. So suppose you have a set system where each element lies in at most t sets. So think of t as some small number, right? So again, if you take this matrix view, your matrix is like column sparse, t column sparse. And actually this is very useful in practice because, if you look at like the incidence matrix of a graph, it's really 2 column sparse, right? Because each column corresponds to an edge and it's just 2 entries and so on. So for many combinatorial problems, this kind of structure actually arises a lot. So for this setting, yeah, again, if you do a random coloring, you won't get anything better than root n, because the row size can still be n, right? It's only column sparsity, that structure we are given. So this 0th generation technique of Beck-Fiala that gave a 2t minus 1 result, or order t discrepancy. And using this stronger tool of partial coloring, one can improve this to root t times log n. Yeah, so strictly speaking, these are uncomparable, because okay, if t is really small like a constant, then maybe this is better, but we should think of this as log n being tiny, so this is a bit better. And then they're using this 3rd generation Banachek result, this deep convex geometric thing. One can actually improve this to root t root log n. And this is the best we know so far, like the strongest techniques we have. And actually the big conjecture in this area, what's called the Beck-Fiala conjecture, is that square root t is the right answer. And even getting a bound like t to the 0.99 would be a major breakthrough. So this is completely open. And there's also further generalization called Comblush conjecture, but let me not go into that. Good. So this was, again, the non-constructive story, right? This Banachek and partial coloring, we didn't know how to make them algorithmic. So about 10 years ago, there were the first results on these things. So there was a bunch of results starting from a paper of mine in 2010, where we could show how to make various applications of this partial coloring approach of Spencer algorithmic. And right, so starting from this first result, then there was a very nice result of Lovett and Maker, which kind of simplified this previous algorithm and gave a very, very beautiful and general technique, which I'll talk about soon, based on random walks and linear algebra, and so on. Right? So by now, actually, there are many various approaches to do this. And what all these approaches have done is they've developed a very nice toolkit involving like high dimensional geometry and techniques from optimization and random walks and so on. And this toolkit has found a lot of applications, because again, discrepancy is used in many places. So sort of wherever discrepancy was useful previously, people could port these ideas to these applications also. And there have been lots of results. And again, my goal will be to give you some sense of how approximation works. Okay, so this was the story for the partial coloring based algorithms. But for this 3rd generation, the Banachek based approach, like things still took a while to get solved. So it's a bit more complex. And so again, we sort of had recent results only 3-4 years ago. And again, sort of this uses a similar toolkit of high dimensional geometry, optimization, and random walks. And these ideas now actually have led to a very nice unified approach to design approximation algorithms, sort of combining iterated rounding and randomized rounding. So again, I'll sort of define these things when we go ahead. Okay, right. So roughly, yeah, my plan for the rest of the talk is the following. So again, we saw discrepancy and some applications. So I want to tell you a bit about this partial coloring method, and in particular, this very beautiful algorithm of Lovett and Maker, and then give you some sense of how this more refined techniques for Banachek's problem, the algorithmic approaches for Banachek, lead to sort of very nice rounding algorithms that I talked about. Okay, so that's the rough plan. Good. So yeah, so for the next couple of slides, I'll talk about the partial coloring method. And again, yeah, so I've stated the theorem here. It looks a bit intimidating, but let's parse this slowly. It's actually a very, very beautiful theorem, and you can think of this as like a refinement of the probabilistic method and a way to sort of beat union bound, which can be useful in many contexts. So let's go over this slowly. So what this result says is the following. So suppose you have any m by n matrix. So I'll think of it as these rows little a1 through an. And the result says the following: pick any parameters lambda 1 through lambda m, one for each row. So yeah, think of these as small numbers. Then there is a coloring x with coordinates between -1 and 1, with at least n over 2 coordinates like +1 or -1. So that's why it's a partial coloring. But so it colors a lot of elements, but not all of them. Such that if I look at any row I, this ai times x is just the discrepancy of row I, right? Or the fractional discrepancy, because x is not a full coloring, but some fractional coloring. Yeah, so you can always find a partial coloring so that the discrepancy of row I is at most this lambda I, whatever bound you wanted, times like the L2 norm, or think of it as square root S, right? Like if your A was 0, 1 with S entries. This is L2 norm is square root S, right? So it says pick your favorite lambda i's. Maybe for some rows you want a low discrepancy, for some rows you don't care, and so on. So as long as you can pick any lambda as you want, so that they satisfy a certain condition, and we'll parse this condition in a moment below, right? So it's some condition like this. So it's a very versatile result. You don't need to know how it's proved. What it's saying is there always exists such a nice coloring. Okay, so let's parse a bit more what this really means. So for a moment, suppose if I did a random coloring instead of some clever coloring. Now we know, right? Like if you look at row I, just by this central limit theorem or whatever, Chernoff bounds, the probability that the discrepancy is bigger than this lambda times the standard deviation, what you'll get, or the L2 norm for rho I, varies like a Gaussian, right? E to the minus lambda I square. So, right. So this is sort of the parameter. So if I just wanted to do a union bound, right? Like I just want to do a random coloring and I want to show, hey, look, I can get lucky that my random coloring satisfies all these bounds for every I, right? So if I want to be lucky with union bound, I would have to pick lambda is in such a way that this sum of the probabilities of going bad for any row is like at most 1, let's say 0.99 or something, right? Because then I can argue with 1% chance I have been succeeding. Now what this theorem, so really, this e to the lambda I square, which might look mysterious, but it's really coming from this Chernoff bound kind of thing. So naive union bound will require you to pick lambda is satisfying this. But what this theorem is saying here is you can pick this right side to be n instead of 1. Now again, this might not look very sort of what's the big deal? It's just 1 instead of like n instead of 1, but it's really powerful. Right. So here is just summarizing this thing. So what it buys you is this n versus 1. And in fact, you don't even get a full coloring. You're only getting a partial coloring. But the point is that because you can tolerate a n here, you can even set lambda to be 0 for lots of rows, right? Like if lambda is 0 for a particular row, this is just 1 e to the 0. So it's even saying I can ask for a fractional coloring, which colors a lot of elements, which gives you 0 discrepancy on all these like linear number of rows, and which turns out to be very, very powerful. Like with union bound, you can't even expect this for a single row because it has to be strictly less than 1. And yeah, and this indeed, like just this flexibility turns out to be very, very powerful. So let me give you sort of one quick example, this Beck-Fiala setting that we talked about of T column sparse matrix. So partial coloring gives square root T log n. And roughly the idea is, again, I'll sort of sketch, not to go in proofs too much. So you can show by a small counting argument that, okay, your set system can be arbitrary, but the number of big sets with size bigger than 10T cannot be too much, like n over 10. So then you can just invoke the partial coloring lemma and say, look, for these big sets, because if I do a random coloring on big sets, they can go really bad, right? They can become root n. But I'll require my partial coloring to have 0 discrepancy on these big guys. I'll just pick lambda 0 on them, and I can afford it because it's only n over 10 of them. And for the remaining sets, you can, which are small sets of size less than 10T, you can pick square root S discrepancy. So yeah, if you put this together, you'll get that there is a partial coloring with discrepancy square root T. And now you can iterate this over log n phases and get a full coloring of root T times log n. So again, sort of, I went over this a bit fast, but the point is, yeah, once you have this very strong hammer of partial coloring, you can sort of cleverly apply it to your set system and get a lot of mileage out of it. Okay. So again, as I said, Spencer's result was very existential. We had no clue how to find such a partial coloring. So here is the algorithm of Lovett and Meka, and I'll actually describe the algorithm and give the analysis on this one slide. So maybe it looks a bit congested. So again, yeah, so this is just repeating what we had. So what they're saying is you can always find a coloring X with a lot of coordinates +1, -1, satisfying this, as long as your lambda is, okay, instead of n over 5, now maybe we need a different constant, but it's okay. And the algorithm is beautiful. What it does is the following. So let's think of it geometrically. So you have this +1, -1 cube. So each vertex corresponds to like a +1, -1 integer point in n dimensions, right? And initially you start with the 0 coloring, which has 0 discrepancy. So that's great. right? So start with some x naught. And what you'll do is just start doing a random walk or a little Brownian motion. So, or a random walk in each dimension with like little tiny increments. So in particular, let's say in each coordinate I add a independent Gaussian with some small multiple delta, and just keep doing this, right? So, okay, so eventually you will hit maybe a face of this walk, a face of this cube, which means some variable has reached +1 or -1, in which case you fix that variable to +1, -1 and keep walking in that face. Okay, or the other thing you can happen is, you want your coloring X not to violate this discrepancy bound for row I. So each such constraint for each row gives you like a hyperplane that you don't want to cross, right? Like, because crossing this would mean you're violating discrepancy for that row. So, okay, so if you're doing a random walk and if you hit such a constraint, okay, you stick to that constraint and keep walking in that subspace, right? Right, so you'll just move in that subspace satisfying this bound. So again, so exactly, so by design, you'll never violate the discrepancy of any set. So of course, the catch is you want to show that a lot of variables will reach +1, -1, because if you only keep hitting these kind of subspace constraints, you will get stuck and not go anywhere. And indeed, what they show is that this condition e to the lambda I square summation over I less than Cn ensures that the walk will reach many faces of the cube before it hits too many of these other constraints that like constrain you how you can move. And again, sort of, it's really a small, one slide computation about this, but I don't want to get into many details. It's a very, very cute algorithm and analysis. Yes, you just do a random walk, and whenever something you're about to violate, you just stick there and just don't violate it and keep doing a random walk there. Right. So this is the whole algorithm. It's really a very beautiful algorithm. And yeah, again, as I said, the analysis is very, very simple. You just need to make this rough idea that I said here a bit more concrete. And again, it's a few applications of Chernow bounds. Okay. So good. So this was the partial coloring method. Again, you can think of it as sort of beating the union bound in a very strong way, which has many applications. And now we have an algorithmic version of this, and this has had a lot of applications. And perhaps the most important one, which I want to mention, or the most significant, is this very interesting result of Rothfuss and refined further by Rothfuss and Hoberg a few years ago, which improves upon this classical result for one-dimensional bin packing by Karmarkar and Karp. So again, bin packing is this fundamental problem. You have numbers between 0, 1, you want to pack in the least number of bins. So the best known result from 81 was a opt plus log square opt guarantee. And actually a big conjecture in this area is to get opt plus order 1 or show that you can't get it. But Rothfuss and Rothfuss-Hoberg managed to improve this log square to log opt using this partial coloring method in sort of a very nice way. Right, and the idea again is because discrepancy is connected to rounding, somehow you can use this Lovett-Meka to get a good rounding algorithm. Okay, so this was all about the partial coloring method that I wanted to share. Let me, in the next 15 minutes or so, talk a bit about this rounding approximation and these connections in a bit more detail. Good. So again, just to remind you, rounding was this question, you want to solve ideally a integer 0, 1 problem. So you write a continuous relaxation, solve the fractional relaxation. And then the question is, how do you go back to 0, 1 while minimizing the loss? Yeah, this is rounding. So again, yeah, this is like the bread and butter of approximation algorithms. So one thing maybe is, so this technique might look a bit ad hoc, for approximation. Okay, why this idea in particular of relaxation and rounding? So I want to say that, there's something deeper about this method. Like even if you look at all hardness results and so on, somehow this how good the relaxations are really captures something inherent about the complexity of problem. So for example, even if you look at efficiently solvable problems, let's say spanning tree or bipartite matching and so on, your favorite combinatorial optimization problem, I mean, one can argue that really, in some sense, why they are exactly solvable is that if you look at a natural linear programming relaxation for that, like a very interesting accident happens in the sense that if you look at this polytope generated by these continuous constraints, some of the vertices of that polytope are integral. And in particular, it's a if and only if thing. Like it's again a basic fact in combinatorial optimization that for any problem, if you can take a fractional solution and round it to an integral one without losing anything, then it is equivalent to saying that the vertices are polytopes. So, or in other words, if you can solve a problem exactly for any objective function, it's equivalent to showing that there is a rounding algorithm that does not incur any loss for it. It's so somehow, yeah, right. There's something inherent about this rounding things. Okay, so how do people use rounding? So again, there are many ways, and whole books have been written. But if you abstract out, there are two main ideas. So let me go over them. And again, probably many of you, this is probably boring for those of you who do approximation for a living, but let me go over it in detail anyway. So first is basic idea is called randomized rounding. And idea is here to view these fractional solution that you got from the LP as probabilities, right? Because they're between 0 and 1. And the simplest possible thing you can do is, for each variable I, you set it independently to 0 or 1 with probability this little xi. So again, I'll use little xi to denote this continuous variable and capital Xi to denote like 0 or 1. So the nice thing about this rounding is, yeah, in expectation, your capital Xi has the right probability, like right marginal. And the thing that really makes randomized rounding work is, this concentration property, that if I look at any linear constraint like CIXI or any row in my constraints, then the chance that you violate it by too much is like exponentially decaying, right? So this is just Chernoff bounds. And again, sort of this is the most simplistic variant of randomized rounding. There are many variants and like all kinds of tricks you can build on this basic idea. Right. And the nice thing about randomized rounding is it's often the best possible, especially if your matrix has no real structure, right? Like if your constraints were just arbitrary or whatever thrown in, I mean, you can't do much else than randomized rounding. And I'll make this a bit precise what I mean with this. Okay. Yeah. So randomized rounding is great, and we have all used this probably, but it's also a very blunt tool, right? Like when you first see this, I mean, I'm not even looking at my matrix. I'm just rounding each variable independently to 0, 1. I mean, this doesn't sound right. And indeed, yeah, it is a blunt tool. And if you have a nice structure in your problem, like suppose your fractional solution X corresponded to some fractional matching or some fractional spanning tree example. I mean, there's no way if you do this randomized rounding, you'll get back an integral matching or integral spanning tree, right? Like without losing anything, as we saw. So, right. So randomized rounding is good if you don't have much structure, but if you have structure, it'll kind of ruin it. It's horrible at preserving structure. And in some sense, you can argue, okay, classical combinatorial optimization is all about using structure, right? I mean, sometimes you have flow problems or spanning trees or matroids, or maybe your matrix has some column sparsity and you want to sort of preserve structure. So indeed, in these cases, you want to do what's called iterated rounding. Sorry, I think, yeah. Okay. So yeah, so I'll go over iterated rounding a bit more formally. Like this is the second method as opposed to randomized rounding. So let's look at the example of bipartite matching, and probably many of us have seen this at some point or the other. So suppose I give you a fractional solution for a perfect bipartite matching, which means for each edge I assign a number between 0 and 1, so that if I look at any vertex, the sum is exactly 1, right? And we know that for matching, if I give you a fractional solution, you can always round it to a 0, 1, like an integral match without losing anything. So let's just see how this is done, and this is just a reminder. So again, the idea is, right, if you have a fractional solution, you can see that you can always find a sort of even cycle of, yeah, so I only have an edge if nothing is 0 or 1. If it's 0 or 1, it's fixed. So the point is, yeah, I can start at any vertex and start following a path. And because these numbers are fractional, strictly between 0 and 1, there'll always be two edges at any vertex, right? Because they have to sum up to 1. So I can always find such a cycle. And then once I have a cycle, I can alternately increase the variables plus by some plus epsilon or minus epsilon and keep doing this in a way that does not increase my cost in some direction, and until some variable reaches 0, 1, right? And then I remove that edge. I pick another cycle if there is there, and keep doing until you'll get an integral matching. So I'm a bit fast on this. I've seen, presumably everybody has seen this at some point. And yeah, this is also what's called pipe edge rounding in general, right? So basically what we did some very smart move to update your solution. Well, okay, so why did we update in this particular way of, pick a even cycle and alternately do plus epsilon or minus epsilon on these edges? The point was that if I look at any vertex, this smart move like preserves the degree exactly, right? Like if you're decreasing something by epsilon, you'll also increase it by epsilon. And this is what we wanted to preserve. So, okay, so we are doing a rounding, but in a smart way by preserving what we wanted to preserve. Okay, so that's the idea for bipartite matching, but let's abstract it out a bit more. And this is exactly what's called iterated rounding. So, right, so maybe it's good to go over this just to get the notation correct. So the idea is iterated rounding is a linear algebraic thing. So let me look at this 0, 1 cube picture. So suppose I have this fractional solution, x of k in some iteration k. Now I want to update it, and because eventually I want to get it to a vertex, which corresponds to an integral 0, 1 solution. So, okay, so in iterated rounding, what do? We solve some system like w times y equal to 0. So y will be like your update direction. So like in the bipartite example, it was the constraints that for every vertex, your plus and minus should sum up to 0, right? So you basically solve some update y by solving some constraints that you want to preserve, and then move in that direction, either here or here, until you reach, so some variable has reached 0 or 1, and then maybe you solve another, right? You pick some another matrix wk to preserve certain constraints, find another update direction. And the point is, if as long as your constraints that you preserve, they are fewer than the number of fractional variables that you have, or more formally, the dimension of this is less than your degrees of freedom, you can always find such update direction, right? You can move sort of in the null space of this wk and fix another variable to be 0, 1, and then keep doing this. So you can iterate this rounding until you get 0, 1. So again, if this was a bit maybe abstract, just think of that bipartite matching example. Like, at each time you find some cycle cleverly and you update along that. Now, again, this might look like a very ad hoc trick. Okay, it works for some problems, but why do I care? So there is this very nice book of R. Ravi, Lapchilao, and Mohit Singh, which actually shows that many, or almost all the classic results in combinatorial optimization, even sort of very esoteric and complicated ones, actually can be viewed in this iterated rounding framework in a very clean way. So all kinds of matroid intersection, matroid problems, and so on. So in some sense, for structured problem, this is kind of a sort of a universal trick, right? And okay, so this is for like exact problems, but also one can use this iterated rounding whenever you have structure in your problem to get like approximation results. So one very famous result is, if you want minimum cost spanning trees, but now with degree bounds on vertices, you can only get them in +1 violation and so on using iterated rounding. So again, the point is, so maybe right. So just to kind of summarize, there are these two broad techniques: randomized rounding, where you just randomly round things, and it gives you concentration, but it might mess up structure. And then there is this very like almost surgical, very precise technique of iterated rounding, which is very linear algebraic, has many rounds. It's great for preserving constraints, but gives you absolutely no concentration or whatever, right? Like it's totally opposite of randomized rounding. And in many cases, you might want to combine the benefits of both these techniques. And roughly, the reason is the following. So again, right, for structured, iterated rounding does great. For unstructured problems, randomized rounding is great. But in many cases, you might have a problem which has both these aspects to it. And again, I'll give an example in the next slide. And once you have that, it's not immediately clear what to do, because if you apply iterated rounding, it will be great on the structured part, but who knows what it does on this other part. And if you do randomized rounding, it will totally ruin the structured part. So in some sense, if you have a joint problem where there are both these parts, maybe you want a rounding which looks random-like for this unstructured part, but yet somehow maintains the structure, which they seem to be very conflicting goals. You want to be random-like, yet maintain some kind of structure. And yeah, maybe let me just give a quick example of why such things might happen. So let's look at a very famous problem called make-span minimization on unrelated machines. So here the setting is you have jobs and machines, and each job J has some arbitrary size Pij on machine I. So it's a very general setting. And you want to assign jobs to machines to minimize the maximum load on any machine. So there's a very famous result of Lenstra, Smush, and Tardosh based on iterated rounding, which gets basically op plus maybe one job of error. Okay, but now if you have a real world, okay, this was kind of a nice theoretical problem, but in real world, you might have many other constraints, maybe you have memory issues, bandwidth, you want fairness and all kinds of other constraints. So this is like the messy unstructured part, right? So yeah, and if you do iterated rounding, it can completely mess this up, but randomized rounding would do great on this part, but might mess this up. So you might actually care about both. And indeed, this idea has been, people have thought about this. So there's a whole area called like negatively dependent rounding or dependent rounding. And one idea there is, again, it's a very nice idea, actually useful in many places. So if you want to get concentration, like with Chernow bounds or whatever, you don't really need independence. Even some notion of negative dependence is enough. Like I won't define what negative dependence means. But one way to intuitively think is like when you update along this cycle, these green and blue edges are negatively, because if you increase one, the other decreases and so on. So yeah, so if you have some kind of negative dependence in your problem, you can get concentration. And there have been very beautiful results on trying to use this negative dependence. So in particular, maybe like these max entropy distributions for spanning trees, which have nice, very strong negative dependence properties and so on. Okay, but the trouble with this dependent rounding is you need this very subtle notion of negative dependence, which is very limiting, and it's only for very few problems. And even if you have it, it requires a lot of ingenuity to sort of design the rounding. Okay, so I'll just state the general result that we can get using these discrepancy techniques. It says the following. So for any problem, so no assumption on the whether you can do dependent rounding or not. If you can apply iterated rounding with some slack. So what do I mean by this? So think of delta as some number like 0.01, so on. So in iterated rounding, we always picked this WK matrix in which null space we walked. So as long as your null space does not span the full dimension of how many variables you have, so as long as you can have some slack in your problem of what constraint you are making tight, the theorem says that with probability 1, you can always satisfy what iterated rounding will give you, but for free, you'll get this concentration property. So think of it intuitively like with probability 1, you will maintain your structure. Like if you wanted spanning tree, you will get spanning tree, but you will have these concentration properties also for every linear constraint. So no matter what linear constraint you had, you'll get this tail bounds. Okay, so again, it's like this theorem is completely generic, no need for negative dependence and so on. So again, let me skip these examples. So I just want to show you like for all these basic problems, you can just, so wherever iterated rounding is used, you can pick any application from this book of Lau, Singh, and Ravi, and just, apply this method with to get concentration for free, essentially. So for all these, so for example, this load balancing problem that we talked about, you can create a small slack, like, so instead of P max error, now you get 1 plus delta P max error for the make span, but now you get concentration properties for free. Okay, so let me just maybe in a couple of minutes say the very high level idea and try to wrap it up. So, okay, so what are we again trying to do? So we are trying to combine randomized rounding and iterated rounding. So let's think of randomized rounding in what seems like a more complicated way, but it'll be useful later. So we have some initial fractional solution that we round to 0 or 1, right? So I can think of it as taking each coordinate and rounding it independently to 0 or 1. Another way I can think of it is I start doing a random walk or like a Brownian motion. And if I hit a face, I freeze there and keep doing a walk there and so on and so forth until I reach a vertex. Okay. Now, the nice thing about this view is, so I claim this is exactly randomized rounding because, I'm doing a random walk. So each variable will get rounded to 0 or 1 with sort of the right marginal. Right? So this is formally the martingale property. So yeah, so this is just a very convoluted way of thinking about randomized rounding. You are doing some random walk or a sticky random walk. But this is nice because you can now sort of combine this with iterated rounding. Because what does iterated rounding tell you? That, okay, you want to update your fractional solution X, but you're only allowed to move in a certain subspace because you want to preserve some structural constraints precisely, right? So, right, so you can now, okay, because maybe you're only allowed to walk in this subspace to round your variable. So a natural thought is to, right, just do a random walk in this subspace until you hit something, and maybe then do another subspace and so on. Now, turns out if you do the most obvious thing of just doing a random walk in this subspace, so this is actually exactly what Lovett Meka was doing, if you recall, because you hit a certain subspace, you just keep walking in that subspace. Now, this can turn out, and again, I'll skip this example here for lack of time. So it turns out this can be a very, very bad idea. You can get like terrible concentration or like completely correlated solution, in fact. So this key idea, which was inspired from all these recent developments for making Banaszczyk's approach in discrepancy constructive, was the following. So again, yeah, you have some fractional solution X. You want to walk in this subspace. So you can actually design a very smart walk based on writing a semi-definite program. So I'll just quickly describe the properties we want. So one is, you want to find this update delta X so that you're walking in this subspace. And the second property you can encode as a semi-definite program is that your walk looks random, even though you walk in that subspace. So yeah, so here is the precise definition. Maybe let me not go over this. And the nice thing is you can write it as a semi-definite program. And one can show that this semi-definite program always has a solution. Or in other words, there is an update direction, or you can sort of design a random walk, which has an amazing concentration property. Right. So, right. So since you're walking in that subspace, you're doing iterated rounding. And since you have concentration, yeah, you'll get concentration. So there are some technical issues, like one has to be careful and use certain martingale type concentration and so on. But yeah, morally, what I said works. Good. So yeah, so maybe just to conclude, so we saw, what discrepancy was, and it's a classical topic with many applications, and recent algorithmic progress on making these on discrepancy problems has led to many applications. So I mostly talk on approximation, but there are also very nice applications in like differential privacy and machine learning and so on and so forth. So yeah, so the hope is, there should be many more applications, and it'll be great to sort of discover this. One final thing I want to also point out is, so there's lots of other areas I did not touch on. So in discrepancy, for example, it's open and maybe for many decades now, like for many, many basic problems like this Beck-Fiala and Steinitz that I talked about, and many others, we don't know like the right tide bounds. So I mentioned already for Beck-Fiala, like square root t was the right conjectured answer, and best we know is square root t root log n. Another thing that has become very popular is this notion of spectral discrepancy. Yeah, so again, maybe some of you have heard about this Cadison-Singer problem, which was the major breakthrough. So yeah, so these are very interesting things. A recent direction that also emerged in the last couple of years was discrepancy for random set systems, where again you use very different techniques to show certain discrepancy properties and very surprising properties. And another direction which came in last year is like, it's called the online discrepancy. So if you think of this vector balancing view, maybe you get vectors one by one online, like you don't see the full future and you still want to color them +1 or -1 to maybe minimize some things. And one can also show very interesting things there. So yeah, so maybe let me just conclude and say, there are lots of directions we still don't know, and probably many more applications to be found. So thank you.
Yeah, so organizers, do you want to take questions, or there's supposed to be the poster session after this?
I think we have time. Let's have 5 minutes for quick questions. That'll be fine.
Okay, so Nikhil, I'll just let you go. Everyone have questions, just go ahead.
So may I ask a question?
Yep.
So this is Yoshi. Yeah, so great talk. Thank you very much. I was wondering whether, because of your concentration results, you can get some kind of counting results for the number of solutions that are kind of close to the optimum?
Right. So those are much harder, like even for knapsack problems and all.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So this notion of concentration is not that strong to really.
Mhm.
Yeah. I mean, maybe one could get exponential type errors, but like definitely not 1 plus epsilon, a
Oh yeah, no.
FPRAS kind of thing. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. But conceivably, yeah, it is like from all possible solutions, it is picking something random, but yeah, far from uniform probably.
Mhm. Thank you.
But that's a nice direction. Yeah. Maybe something can be done.
Well, I don't know whether people need encouragement, so I'll ask a second question, then maybe people will kind of start asking more questions. So could you say something? So in this loved Mecca, you compared, I kind of understood that you compared the probability that you hit a wall of the hypercube against the probability that you hit a constraint. So can you say something, is that right? And can you say something about the geometry of these two polytopes?
Yeah.
Because
Let me go. Yeah, it's a beautiful algorithm. So let me spend like half a minute, really what's going on. So, right, we want to color so we want to find this partial coloring where a lot of variables are +1, -1 without like violating these discrepancies with our desired target. So what they're saying is like the most natural algorithm you would think, okay, you start from the all zero coloring and you want to reach +1, -1. So just keep doing a Brownian motion, let's say, at the beginning. And now two things can happen. Some variable reaches +1 or -1. So you stick the face of give, and that's great. You have made progress. And keep doing, right? So if you hit maybe here, you keep walking. Okay, the other thing that it can happen is you hit one of these blue constraints, which is this discrepancy violation constraint. And you don't want to cross that constraint because you want. Okay, so you keep walking in that thing. So what has happened? Like initially your walk was n dimensional because you had n variables. Every time you hit either a face or a constraint, your dimension in which you can walk reduces by 1. Right. So at some point when you use up all your n dimensions, you'll get stuck. Right. You can't walk anymore. So, but if you can show like by the time you got stuck, at least you hit n over 2 faces or something with high probability, then it's great because you have found your partial coloring, which has n over 2 variables without violating. And again, yeah, so the point is like this condition e to the minus lambda I square less than Cn ensures that these blue constraints are sufficiently far. So like you could hit n over 10 of them or whatever before you get stuck. So you would have hit like 90% of the constraints on these faces. So yeah, so that's the geometric aspect, which needs a proof, but yeah. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Yeah, thank you.
And I guess it's been 5 minutes, and Nikhil, you said you were going to be in the lobby.
Yeah, I'll be around.
So, all right.
Great. Okay.
Maybe
Thank
call
you.
it then.
Great. Thanks.